My name is Michael Araujo. I am the Executive Director of Rhode Island Jobs with Justice. I'm also a board member of EPI, AFL-CIO, etc. I am here to testify against enabling legislation for P3s for a couple of reasons. First off, the experience in other states such as Maryland, Massachusetts, California, Kentucky, North Carolina, Maryland, Texas, Alabama has not been a positive one. There have been several lawsuits between unions and the contracting agencies or the P3 awardees. The lack of competition has closed off several avenues towards healthy building environment, also a healthy operation environment for public sector jobs and services. So there's that. It's the Machinist Union in Central California in particular had a very, very difficult fight against, I believe it was Meridian, I believe was the company that was the initial one, in which their membership watched their wages cut drastically as well as their hours. MBTA in Boston after the snowstorm, we saw, again, it was Meridian, was the company botch a snow removal operation causing significant delays. The issue of accountability becomes central, and then the democratic delivery of services also becomes the central issue. There's no actual requirement, since profit is part of the motive and the value driver for this, for underserved communities to be served to the same level as more profitable communities. So as with Boston with the public sector transit system, we are seeing the more far-reaching neighborhoods not receive service. John Doherty, who's the director of the Massachusetts Transit Coalition, has indicated great dismay that this is a potential in the offing in Rhode Island, and saying that there is a good shot that this is a path towards open privatization, and that is a risk, and that's a serious risk. And then there's the principled argument against it, that the services and the places that are owned and utilized by the general public belong to them. No part of their tax dollar should be going to be siphoned off to private profit. It also means that costs would be externalized instead of internalized, which is the way they should be in a municipality or in a state. There's no doubt that we have a need for serious infrastructure improvement, but that should be done in a more rational way, such as increasing revenue from the appropriate sources. We have not seen significant corporate tax increases. In fact, we've seen corporate tax decrease in Rhode Island, which obviously decreases our ability to fund public sector projects. So by going to alternative financing outside of the state, that's forcing us into a position where either we increase taxes drastically immediately in order to fund these projects, or we depend on private capital who, with non-competition clauses, also without stability clauses, could potentially withdraw. And that is one of the risks. The other indication that we should know is that anytime an organization decries the democratic process, you should be afraid of that organization. The quote about the public process, the legislative process, being a disease should cause great dismay, right? Anyone that says that is not necessarily a friend of the public. They are definitely a friend of their own interest. And there's nothing wrong with being a friend of your own interest, but don't mistake the two. In the experience of other countries, public-private partnerships have led to drastic decreases in services as well. Meridian, in particular, in India, caused a massive, massive reduction in the access to clean and clear water for underserved communities. The partnerships that we're looking at, or streamlining the process, would eliminate important and vital public comment, and also our representatives to view what the actual project is. Yes, it might take a little bit longer. The democratic process should not necessarily be a streamlined process. Spending the public's money also should not necessarily be a streamlined process. Then in regards to hiring practice, Rhode Island is currently approaching some of the lowest levels of unemployment that we've seen in a very long time, which is much to do with our generalized economic recovery, but also to do with Rhode Islanders traveling out of state. where there's a much more robust revenue stream and more rational revenue process, like Massachusetts and Connecticut. However, in the urban core of Rhode Island, among African Americans and among the Latino community, unemployment in Ward 8, for example, is at 45%. We are seeing a radically uneven recovery, and we're seeing a radically uneven hiring process when it comes to public projects. We are seeing no assurance inside any of the history of public-private partnerships that the hiring that is done is meaningful and takes into account the real lived experience of our citizens and our residents. In fact, we have seen examples in Maryland, for example, where not only were they ignored, but they were facing lawsuits against them for ignoring hiring practice. Then when it comes to minority contracting, the lack of meaningful completion granting or bonding structures has closed off many of public-private partnerships projects to minority contractors who otherwise would have had access to them. And without meaningful competition, with the no competition clause that most PPPs require, means that access to those are fully closed off. This indicates a flight of capital out of our state and not a retention. It also indicates a potential disruption to our working community and a driving down of wages inside the projects that are completed, as we saw in Massachusetts with the MBTA. So I'm urging great caution in this. I'm also urging that if this is something that is seriously being considered, that requirements for completion bonding for minority business be included, that first source hiring also be considered, that accountability be considered, and that caps on the profitability also be considered, and that there is a way to recapture the wealth that would be otherwise leaving the state. Obviously, we all want to see construction trade and meaningful jobs come back to Rhode Island, but we don't want to do that at the expense of our long-term health or the use of our civic facilities themselves. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Maybe a couple of any questions from our commission members? Press the button, John. Thanks.
You indicated the lack of competition within the agreement. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, many PPPs contain inside of them no competition clauses. In fact, it's a fairly standard part of most enabling legislation.
By non-competition?
So once
individual, or is it the vendor itself?
Well, yeah. So if we're doing a streamlined pathway or enabling legislation, then that effectively closes the bidding process. And that closing the bidding process eliminates competition.
Are you referring to unsolicited proposals? Is that what you're
No, I am not. Yes.
If I might explore that. Off here, bear with me. The procurements that I'm experienced with teams will come together. Generally, there'll be some lead project management type team, maybe the design element, the engineer. And it might include an operator at the end of the day. And then a whole host of subcontractors dealing with a lot of the infrastructure construction that's required or some basic work. And those are more often than not, local contractors who team up. And I think if this is what you're referring to, then I understand that they'll team up exclusively with that prospective team leader bidder, as opposed to being able to join any other team. Right.
So not necessarily. That would be so. If in the trade that I used to work in, which was construction and film, is that I would expect a retention of certain subcontractors to maintain relationships. That's not unusual, but that would be retention. The non-competitive part is in the overall contracting of the work itself. Right. So if we have a Gilbane who is bidding on a project, that project would be managed by Gilbane. But in that process, in the opening up of the bidding process, other large-scale construction would be allowed to make an offer, correct? Right? So most PPP projects eliminate that aspect, that there is a single vendor that they work with, and then that becomes the vendor that you're married to.
Right, that's one approach that they take.
Yeah, that's
They
one
also
approach. So
will-
that's in Massachusetts.
Some will also, for some of the work, maybe
Right.
not the work that's,
If I may-
go ahead.
So your concept is if we go out for a proposal and there's a vendor pick, we'll use Gilbane. So you're saying is the lack of competition, if Gilbane puts together a team, they propose and they are selected, that somehow is less competitive?
No, I'm sorry. I'm definitely not being clear, I guess.
I'm not, so you may just not be getting through to us. That
No,
could be another
it's
thing.
possible. Like, I think conceptually, it's a fair, this is relatively new.
But I'd like to understand your
Yeah,
point.
so I'm working on it. So MBTA is a good example where there's a public-private partnership, right? The partner is Meridian. I believe the gentleman from Meridian testified last time before you guys. That contract won't be up to bid. They are the exclusive manager of MBTA, according to Charlie Baker. However, that is not up for review regardless of performance. Right. So now that they're the contract holder, you are beholden to them. However, if it was still a public agency, you could call them back. You could call back the employees. You could call back management. You can call back oversight in a much closer process. For construction, it's different. So for Gilbane, that would be a very different thing. But so one of the things that the AI boasts about management practice in is public parks and transportation, which traditionally have been held by municipalities. To turn over those aspects is to lose a significant amount of control and then be married to a single vendor.
If you group projects for a term of years, I haven't seen any done for parks, to tell you the truth. And I'm not quite sure how that applies.
Ogden Corp. and Roger Williams Park was a PPP.
Well, they were a service vendor, weren't they, or were they a construction vendor?
They weren't construction. They were service delivery. But they did park maintenance, so they was in that.
If I may then, from my sense, it's my, I think, inability to understand what you're saying is, if I can follow it, if someone goes out on a concession or an operational 3P, they in turn would then be able to hire the construction side of the apprentice. That's what you're saying, and that does provide a lack of what we'll call public competition.
Right. So, or maybe it's not looking at it that way. Maybe it's looking at the lack of transparency. Maybe that's a more clearer way to look at it, is that the process can remain opaque because they could open up the process to their competitor, in which case that would lessen their value.
Is there a comfort level on your part if that was to occur?
So the Jobs with Justice in particular sees P3s as pathways to just open privatization. It's the same process, it's just with a different name. I know the argument is that you maintain ownership of the actual whatever. Like if it's a bridge, obviously you maintain ownership of the bridge, but in other areas, that's not always the case. That the return, either the return guarantee or the process ends up closed off, municipalities lose control of their own assets.
So the alternative to that is what?
Well, so for construction,
public operation, public construction.
No. So for
typical
highway
build,
or for infrastructure construction, obviously you have to use a reputable contractor as the overarching agency. But the existing process of open bidding, without streamlining, because it's not. I think 5 months was the amount of time that was indicated before. Is not an excessive amount of time for public comment, for open input, and for all, et cetera. For the democratic part of this to take place in large-scale construction. But in the other areas where there can be partnerships, which in AIAI's model includes transportation, waterfront services, et cetera, then that would indicate a significant loss of state asset or loss of control of state asset. And that is a huge risk. There are the things that make a Commonwealth, or Rhode Island for that sake, are important, are shared ownership of the things that we value, including parks, transportation, some of the recreation stuff. If we lose control of that, and PPPs have been seen as a tool of that, right? So if you're defending the motivation for a representative or a parks agent or somebody who's control of the process, are answerable to one body, and that's to the people of Rhode Island. When you engage a third-party partner who is answerable to a fourth and fifth party, then their values and their motivation could be at direct conflict with that of the people of Rhode Island. If it's tax money, the benefit of that tax money should wholly go back to the citizens of Rhode Island. That a portion of it used for construction, where you're paying taxes for a service of the building of the service, and the output is that product, the bridge or the road, is for use to everybody. But no part of that cost beyond the needs of the actual contractor should be going to line a fourth party who administers.
Just an observation, and you can comment on it if you care to. And I appreciate your comments, really, because we are trying to think seriously about what course we take with respect to using P3s as a delivery method in Rhode Island. Now, you'll hear a little bit later that we've been using them for decades in certain areas, such as wastewater, drinking water in particular, where we're kind of new to it with respect to transportation projects. But if you think about some of the situations with publicly operated water facilities, some of the stories nationally aren't very, very good. And frankly, in my day, I've seen plants, and I've seen what happens to plants which lack attention and maintenance over a long period of time, and how close they can be to failure or causing problems for the public that relies on that water or wastewater services. And I think the history in Rhode Island also dictates much the same with respect to highways. We're good at building them, but not very good at maintaining them. I think that's changing, but I don't know whether the process that exists now can continue to sustain that, or whether what we're trying to examine is whether a public-private partnership approach would be a better way to sustain and maintain that. And again, in a manner that doesn't discriminate, that provides services to those, those of us who need them. And I don't think just kind of defaulting back to the more traditional, tried and untrue, if you will, methods of design, bid, build, change order, and then don't maintain it, and then you reconstruct it several decades later, is the approach that we should take. That's kind of got us where we are now. But the issues that you raise, have some resonance with me, and I am concerned that whatever we shape here as an approach, whatever recommendation that we might make to the House of Representatives, in our case, kind of take into account some of those concerns in particular, because we're trying to serve the same community, and I think so is the House of Representatives, and so are the public agencies that are involved in providing these services. But what's happened over the years, I think, I saw for more than a decade just cuts after cuts after cuts annually on operating budgets. I started my career helping create the Department of Environmental Management, and I don't see privatized parks and beaches. I just can't envision that, but that's just me. But if you've got some kind of a response to that, I'm just giving you kind of some of the insight in terms of my thinking.
I'll be very, very brief. You're right about water systems in other places. Flint obviously being the most egregious example, right? I was lucky enough to grow up in New York with the incredibly well-maintained water system, right? I mean, family's from Rhode Island, but we grew up in New York. So much of the discussion that we're having now is largely because states and federally we have decided to shift priorities away from infrastructure. It was just 30 years ago when 4% of our GDP went towards infrastructure spending. That was more than enough to keep roads maintained, keep our water supplies satisfied, keep our sewage systems solid, right? Probably not an appropriate pun to use in the moment. But 4% has been historically kind of a magic number for expenditure from states and from federal government to maintaining systems that we need, our communication system, which includes roads, our waterways, which includes what we drink. In recent years, over the past 25, 30 years, we've seen that same portion cut down to less than 0.5%. So what we're doing, though, is by extracting more and more of the tax revenue and putting it into private hands, is we're actually speeding up the process of withdrawing money from our revenue base. That ends up being the ultimate issue, is that we know there's a need, and we know that it has to be addressed, that we don't have a choice. We need roads and we need water. These are things that most civilized societies agree are municipal or public, held in the public interest and held in the public good, with no portion of it being siphoned off to any aspect of profit. That there's, in some places, that's seen as a risk, a significant risk. Since we recognize the need, though, then is it possible that we need to be more creative about the solution than going to a private sector for a solution, which, to be completely frank, does not have a very good record? It doesn't. The majority of businesses fail. When private business has operated water systems, they have not always done so in completely ethical manners. When they have operated roads, they have sometimes cut corners that have led to issues of safety. And when it comes to worker treatment, they have not always been the first and best. So, yes, I believe that this is a meaningful conversation that needs to happen. However, the actual root cause that we need to look at is how we derive revenue in the state and whether we are willing to let an aspect of our publicly trusted held revenue goes to a private business that possibly does not have our interests at the center of their heart. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I just urge you to stay involved, continue to participate. Please, please participate. We'd like to hear your voice here. I think it's helpful.
Thanks
so much.